Dear colleagues, we now move on to the next business this afternoon, which is the debate on the state of media freedom in Europe, presented by Mr. Mats Johansson on behalf of the Committee on Culture, Science and Education, Education and Media. I would remind colleagues that speaking time this afternoon is limited to 3 minutes. If the rapporteur and the chairman of the committee and others could take their place, we can proceed to start the debate. Could I say at the start of the debate, as I just indicated, speaking time is limited to 3 minutes. In order to finish by 7:30 and allow sufficient time for responses to the debate and for voting on quite a number of amendments, we will have to interrupt the list of speakers in the debate at about 7 p.m. Is that agreed? Thank you. Point of order, Madam.
Gracias, señor presidente. Antes de pasar al próximo debate, sí quisiera dejar constancia en el diario de sesiones de esta Asamblea Parlamentaria que el martes pasado, cuando se debatía el informe sobre Bulgaria, tuve un error a la hora de votar las enmiendas que presentaba y sus enmiendas que presentaba el señor Volonté y que presentaba la Comisión. Y, por lo tanto, yo estaba a favor del informe de Bulgaria y quiero que quede constancia en el diario de sesiones de la Asamblea Parlamentaria, a pesar de que mi voto no puede ser cambiado. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam. You've made your point. It will be recorded in the record, and that will be there for others to read. It's agreed, therefore, that we will finish the list of speakers at 7 p.m. And I would now like to call Mr. Johansson, the rapporteur. You have 13 minutes in total, which you may divide between your presentation of the report and the reply to the debate. Mr. Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now to the grand finale of this day. It's a pleasure to introduce my report, The State of Media Freedom in Europe, to you. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by saying that this has been an exciting work over 2 years. From the start, with hearings and conferences and background reports and several committee meetings. This comes in a time when free speech and free media is in decline in many countries. In 2012, more than 100 journalists in the world were killed, thousands arrested and intimidated. Our part of the world, Europe, is by no means spared from the strains of times. The state of media freedom in Europe is deteriorating. It is not as free of problems of free speech as it should be in a community of countries guided by the European Convention of Human Rights, and especially its Article 10. Let me quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and import information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers." So, dear colleagues, that is why I am here, to defend these universal principles, not to defend any country or national interest, pride or prejudice. If you take part of the yearly ranking done by the think tank Freedom House, you note that too many of our member countries have been degraded over the last few years. And some of that is, of course, reflected in the paper before you. Free speech and media freedom is especially important in times of crisis in our societies. The people's right to know is a major pillar of democratic rule. As Thomas Jefferson told us more than 200 years ago, He preferred a society of newspapers without the government rather than government without newspapers. As politicians, we should also constantly remind us what Voltaire once taught us, that free speech and media freedom is not only for ourselves and our excellent views, but also for our opponents and their bad ideas. Therefore, this free speech must always be protected against limitation and intimidation. During this process, I've been approached mainly by representatives of two of the nations mentioned in my report, Hungary and Turkey. Let me say that these contacts have been of a proper nature, with serious discussions mostly on the general media situation in these countries. My conclusion of these contacts is that A, it matters what the Council of Europe says, and B, sincere efforts are made in both countries to reform, to better apply to European standards of free media. But that work is far from finished, and the danger is always present that a political majority in any of our member countries tries to interfere with and limit the freedom and independence of the media, not to mention the rights of free speech for all citizens. Let me conclude by, I don't want to interrupt anybody who has more important stuff to discuss, sorry. Let me conclude my introduction by saying that since 1970, this Assembly has adopted some 50 resolutions with recommendations about different aspects of the subject of media freedom, from Resolution 428 on mass communication, media and human rights in 1970, to the latest, number 1950 of 2011, on the protection of journalist sources. I wish my report could be the last in a perfect Europe with all members of our club applying to the same standards, respecting the rules of the club based on shared values, but we are not there yet. So thanks for your confidence so far, dear colleagues, and a special thanks to my two advisors, Mr. William Horsley, Media Researcher of Great Britain, and Rudiger Dossow of the Secretariat of the Culture Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johansson. You will have 7 minutes and 40 seconds to further intervene in the debate and at the end. In the debate, I'm going to call the speakers in the order on the speakers list. As I said at the start, 3 minutes is the time limit. We have 47 speakers on the list. If we're going to get most of those through, I'm going to be very firm with the 3-minute limit. I will allow you to finish your sentence at 3 minutes, and then I shall cut the microphone off and call the next speaker. So the first speaker is Mr. Mogens Jensen from Denmark on behalf of the Socialist Group. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, on behalf of the Socialist Group, I would like to thank Mr. Johansson for this very comprehensive and detailed report on the state of media freedom in Europe. Freedom of expression and media freedom are leading principles for the work in the Council of Europe, and the Socialist Group welcomes that the Culture Committee has put greater light on freedom of expression and for the situation of media by appointing a special rapporteur, Mr. Johansson, for the subject. The report paints an alarming picture of the conditions for journalists and the free press in a number of European countries. The time doesn't allow me to mention all countries where the situation is unacceptable. Therefore, I'll concentrate on the major problems. In Russia, we have, unfortunately, experienced several murders on active journalists, while others have fallen victims to outrageous, violent attacks. Those attacks must come to an end, and the Parliamentary Assembly must urge the Russian government to admit its liability to stop violence and murders and to secure safe working conditions for media and journalists. There's also reason to be shocked by the high number of journalists imprisoned, detained or prosecuted in Turkey for having expressed their political opinions and contributed to the democratic political debate. We must demand effective action from the Turkish government, including that the findings by the Commissioner of Human Rights in his report of the 12th of July 2011 are fully implemented by the government without delay. The Socialist Group fully supports the recommendations to the Committee of Ministers to invite media freedom organizations to regularly report serious violations of media freedom to the Secretary-General of the Council and to have this information available to the relevant bodies of the Council. As well as we support the creation of an internet-based platform for the processing and dissemination of the information given by, among others, the media freedom organizations. This will allow the Parliamentary Assembly on an annual basis to follow and discuss the status of media freedom as we are doing now with Mr. Johansson's report. We also find it very important that the lack of openness concerning the ownership of media in a number of countries demonstrated in this report also is elaborated in the future work on media issues, as well with media responsibility and ethical standards and fundamental journalist principles being upheld by European medias. Once again, I thank Mr. Johansson for his unique work. The Socialist Group fully supports this report.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jensen, for sticking to the time limit. I now call Mr. Kennedy from the United Kingdom on behalf of the ALDE Group. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too, on behalf of the group, congratulate Mr. Johansson and his Secretariat colleagues and pay particular and pleasurable note to the input of the distinguished former BBC foreign correspondent and independent journalist and acknowledged international expert in these fields of Mr. William Horsley. There's a slight irony, I suppose, Mr. Chairman, in any group of politicians discussing the press and journalism in particular. I don't know how this will translate, and I apologise to the translators if I'm making life difficult, but the correct relationship between politicians and the press is sometimes compared to the relationship between dogs and lampposts, but you're never very sure at any given time which is the dog and which is the lamppost. That is something we have to bear in mind as elected practicing politicians in our respective democracies. But without the corrective presence of a free press, there is no doubt that our task would be undermined, as would the quality of the democracy that we represent. This report, on a much more serious level, brings into graphic relief the continuing violence that is all too often the case where journalism is concerned. And indeed, the year before last, in the excellent book that the Council produced, Human Rights and the Changing Media Landscape, the point was made there that threats against one journalist, and I quote, can have the devastating effect of silencing many others. Too much silence is much more ominous than too much noise in a democracy, and the press is there to generate both heat and light in that respect. Indeed, a very good personal friend of mine, Mary Colvin, the war correspondent of the Sunday Times, lost her life in tragic circumstances just last year, and we mourn her passing. But with the rights of journalism, which are essential, must go responsibilities upon those journalists as well. And the report is well balanced in acknowledging that fact. We are in the middle, as many other colleagues will know, of a major debate in the United Kingdom at the moment, the Levinson inquiry, which is leading in due course, has already been discussed, is under discussion in both houses of the United Kingdom Parliament, and we will have to see what the final outcome will be. We have to have greater safeguards for the press, and there have been examples of extreme excess leading to criminal prosecutions underway, but we must at the same time maintain a free press. That is the signal that this report sends, and my Liberal colleagues and myself are only too happy to support.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. I now call Sir Roger Gale of the United Kingdom on behalf of the European Democrat Group.
Thank you, Mr. President. Could I congratulate Mr. Johansson on a customarily thorough report? As he says in his summary, freedom of expression and information constitutes a cornerstone of good governance and thriving democracy. And Mr. Johansson's report indicates some specific shortcomings in some countries. But there's now, Mr. Chairman, perhaps a greater concern. We've seen in the United Kingdom how press power without press responsibility can lead to calls for greater controls over the media. Lord Justice Leveson's report, which was published last year, pointed, in the wake of allegations of press and police corruption, to tighter and possibly draconian regulation. This week, the publication of a European Commission document, A Free and Pluralistic Media to Sustain European Democracy, written by a high-level group on media freedom and pluralism, contains some sound recommendations. But the link between media freedom and EU democracy justifies a more extensive competence of the EU with respect to these fundamental rights is little more than a thinly veiled proposal for European Commission control over what are described in Orwellian terms as national media supervisors. Now, this creeping attempt by the EU to extend media control beyond its 27-country remit is highlighted in a letter dated the 23rd of January from the Committee of Ministers to my colleague, Mr. Chope. In spite of the determination that the Council of Europe should proceed with our review on transfrontier broadcasting, Ambassador Held, chairperson of the Commission of the Ministers' Rapporteur Group, says that Commissioner Mrs. Kroes asserts that the EU has exclusive competence to enter into agreements in the field covered by the European Transfrontier Television Convention. That's the 2011 position. And it appears that this intervention continues to cause delay to the proper work of the Council of Europe. All of this, Mr. Chairman, reaffirms the tensions between the media on the one hand and the regulators, governments and potential censors on the other. And it underscores why Mr. Johansson must be allowed to continue his work, generating his invaluable series of reports. The twin demands of media freedom and media responsibility continue to face this Assembly with a very great challenge.
Thank you, Sir Roger. And now call Mr. Kökçü from Turkey on behalf of the United European Left.
Oh, we will welcome the report. It's very timely and accurate. It is erected on the major binding documents of the Council of Europe and refers to indubitable facts and figures pertaining to violations of media freedom in 14 countries and thus leaves no escape for the perpetrators. Those rulers criticizing this report had not displayed even a crumb of the tolerance for investigative journalists that they had for their murderers, made the passing of this report embarrass them heavily and equip the media rights activists with greater justification in their campaign without borders for broader media freedom. Indeed, all the authorities from 14 countries referred to in this report bear one common characteristic. They, in spite of hypocritical exaltations of the European values vis-à-vis past practices of the single-party dictatorships of the Cold War days, perpetuate today the same state-society relations patterns, notwithstanding which camp they had belonged to then. For them, there exists only one European value, which is not European at all in the 21st century context: the unlimited reign of free market capitalism and unlimited use of force for protecting the power and wealth of the new ruling classes. In their Europe, there is indeed no place at all for human rights, for enlightenment, for critical thought, for labor rights, for anti-racism, for anti-fascism, for feminism, for socialism, those genuinely European values for which the best personalities of this continent have sacrificed their lives. Almost one-third of this report rightly refers to violations committed against media freedom in Turkey, which inhabits the largest jailed journalist population in the world. And I regret Turkey's ruling party deputies, even here, do not refrain from charging the victims of the violations of media freedom who are jailed under irrelevant claims as criminals and or terrorists. Here we are. In this new post-9/11 era, the terrorist replaces the communists when it comes to stigmatize political opponents and critics. Just yesterday, a Turkish court has arrested a 21-year-old newspaper journalist alongside 4 others under charges of terrorism. Terrorists unarmed. This is Turkey's contribution to European media law in the 21st century. Just have a look at the European Court of Human Rights 2012 balance sheet of applications by individuals against their states issued today. Unsurprisingly, the top 10 is a replica of the countries lined down in this draft resolution. Gold medal goes to Russia. Turkey catches the silver. Italy the bronze, to be followed 37 others. No need to blame journalists, monsieur. Your peoples are placing you at where you have reserved for yourselves. We expect that the Assembly will not display any tolerance for violations of media freedom and pass this draft unanimously. Thank you.
Mr. Kirkchu, I now call Ms. Kovac from Serbia on behalf of the EPP Group.
Thank you, distinguished chairman, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like, on behalf of my political group, to congratulate the honourable rapporteur for his work in preparing this report. I would like to stress that since media freedom and safety of journalists are necessary conditions for promoting democracy, we have to ensure that journalists can work freely and in safety. On the other hand, there is unfortunately an increase in the different forms of violations of media freedom, such as physical assaults, attacks on journalists and murders, misuse of governmental power to influence the media, as well as threats linked to media ownership. We are strongly against any attempts of exerting political influence aimed at silencing the critical media. The media plays an important role both in the political process and in everyday life. Although it is not an institution of the state, it is often referred to as the fourth power due to its influence on public opinion. Stressing the importance of media freedom as well as freedom of expression, journalists' working conditions and primarily their own safety is a necessary condition for any democracy. The public must be allowed to be informed on matters of public concern, as well as to receive information through the media. Journalists should be able to provide accurate and reliable information on matters of public interest. Therefore, investigative journalism should be supported, protected, and promoted. In conclusion, there are still unprotected journalists. They are often easy targets and victims of violent actions. Despite our willingness to protect them, this is the sad fact. That is the reason why we, politicians, must seriously take into account the specific needs for safety legislation. We must guarantee the effective protection for everyone, especially for the people who do their jobs properly. The concrete action that could be enforced against violent perpetrators will contribute to promoting media freedom and protection of journalists. Our aim should be to let journalists do their job adequately, make them investigate as much as possible, and motivate them to be active and useful, but at the same time provide them with safety, since they are allowing us to be well-informed and enjoy our basic right to information. I must also stress that the EPP Group decided to support both of the amendments about the Georgian public broadcaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Kovac. The rapporteur will reply at the end of the debate, but I understand Mr. Johansson would like to comment on the contributions of the political groups. Mr. Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a special thanks for a first-time rapporteur in this assembly to feel the support of all the 5 party groups and the nice words that were said. Let me just comment short upon what was said by Mr. Kennedy and Sir Roger Gale about the responsibility of the media in light of the Leveson report. Of course, this is also very important that we keep our focus on. That's why I today have co-sponsored a motion raised by Mr. Mogens Jensen that will be dealt with in the April session about the ethics of journalism. There's a fine line between criticizing media and do over-regulation. So we will have that debate in April, where to stand. Let me also support Sir Roger's remark about this media report presented to the European Commission. That is a temptation now in the European Union, whether in the Commission or the Parliament, to act for new regulation. We have to keep our eyes on what is happening there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johansson. The next speaker in the debate is Mr. Kalmar from Hungary. He is with the EPP group. Mr. Kalmar.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, dear colleagues. First of all, I congratulate Mr. Johansson and his team for their important work. This is an overview of the situation describing the aspects and also the most important problems of this issue. Also, since I am a local politician too, I do not find here some maybe smaller but very important aspects which influence the freedom of media. Let's not forget that, first of all, a medium is an economic enterprise. Once I asked the chief editor of a newspaper, how do you manage to harmonize the financial goals stated in the business plan with journalist ethics? His answer was, I quote, "We try to keep ethical rules, but reaching the figures stated by the owner in the business plan is primordial." My conclusion was that some of the media, in order to survive, renounce totally or partially to their freedom. This is true also in the case of individual journalists. First of all, a journalist is an employee who has responsibilities towards his family. So not only politics influences media freedom, but also the economical situation of the journalists and of the medium. It is very difficult to find a solution to this problem treated above. I dare to say that it is almost impossible. The financing source influences the freedom we speak about. Dear colleagues, my country, Hungary, is also mentioned in the report. The Act of 2010 on media services and on the mass media and the Act of 2010 on freedom of the press and on the basic rules relating to media content had been criticized at EU and COE level too. Hungarian authorities had a very intensive dialogue with international bodies on this issue. The Council of Europe made several recommendations to the Hungarian authorities, including the repeal or revision of a number of provisions regarding notably protection of journalist sources, registration requirements for a broad range of media, the establishment of subjective criteria relating to the information. In the line with EU law, the acts had been examined and also modified by the Hungarian Parliament. In December 2011, the Constitutional Court of Hungary proclaimed several provisions unconstitutional and annulled them. In addition, the court obliged the Parliament to adopt new legislation until the end of May 2012. The Parliament adopted the amending law and declared it on the 18th of June in 2012. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I now call Mr. Szabo, Mr. Vilmos Szabo from Hungary, from the Socialist Group.
Danke, sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, meine Damen und Herren, ich gratuliere auch dem Rapporteur zu dem Bericht. Ich bin einverstanden mit den aufgezählten Grundsätzen und auch mit den Beschlussanträgen. Es ist sehr wichtig zu betonen, dass die Redefreiheit und die Freiheit der Information wirklich Ecksteine in der Geltung der Freiheitsrechte und der guten Regierung sind. Die Sicherung dieser Grundsätze sind für die Mitgliedstaaten des Europarates von grundlegender Bedeutung und elementare Pflicht. In dem Bericht sind mehrere konkrete Fälle erwähnt und 9 Mitgliedstaaten sind namhaft gemacht, wo auf die öffentlich-rechtlichen Medien politischer Druck ausgeübt wird. Das ist eine schwere Feststellung. Diese Länder müssen fortdauernd auf ihre übernommene Verpflichtung aufmerksam gemacht und man soll sie auffordern zur Einstellung des politischen Drucks. Es ist eine Verpflichtung, die Bedingungen zu sichern. welche in den öffentlich-rechtlichen Medien in der Tagesarbeit die politischen Einmischungen ausschließen. Dementsprechend soll man die allgemeine Regelung der Medien, auch die innere Regelung für die Journalisten und die Sicherung der redaktionellen Unabhängigkeit gestalten. Es ist eine unerlässliche Bedingung der Vermeidung der politischen Einmischung, wenn in der Medienführung nicht die Treue zu einer Partei dominiert. Die Regierungsparteien haben auf diesem Gebiet eine hervorgehobene Verantwortung. Sie dürfen die öffentlich-rechtlichen Medien nicht zur Bedienung ihrer eigenen parteipolitischen Ziele gebrauchen. Ich muss den Punkt auch erwähnen, wofür leider jeden Tag Beispiele angeführt werden können. Angriffe gegen Journalisten, die Bedrohung ihres Lebens, Einkerkerung von Journalisten. Man muss in jedem einzelnen Fall entschlossen auftreten. Die Täter und die Verantwortlichen dürfen die Strafe und die Verurteilung nicht vermeiden. Mein Land